A shadow moves through a misty forest, a robed figure vanishing between ancient oaks. What if one of the most powerful and knowledgeable groups in ancient Europe was systematically erased from history? We are not talking about simple wise men in white robes, but the Celtic Druids, a formidable intellectual and political class. Their sudden disappearance from the historical record is one of the medieval period's most profound mysteries. By the end of this, you will understand the true story of their secret banishment, a tale of military conquest, legal persecution, and cultural warfare. We will uncover how an entire class of scholars and judges was forced into the shadows and explore what ancient knowledge might have been lost with them forever. What do you believe happens when a civilization decides to silence its most learned voices? They were far more than reclusive sages gathering herbs in sacred groves. The Celtic Druids formed the very backbone of their society, a highly educated class that served as judges, historians, poets, and astronomers. Imagine a single person holding the combined authority of a Supreme Court justice, a university professor, and a revered spiritual leader. That was the power and responsibility of a Druid. They were the intellectual elite, the keepers of law and tradition, and the essential mediators between the common people and the divine. Their training was famously rigorous, a mental marathon that could last up to 20 years. All of this immense knowledge, from complex legal precedents to epic poems and detailed astronomical observations, was committed entirely to memory. They preserved their entire cultural library inside their minds, passing it down through generations by spoken word alone. This commitment to oral tradition is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Because the Druids themselves left no written records, our entire understanding of them is filtered through the writings of others, primarily the Romans who would later conquer their lands. Their profound silence in the historical record was not an accident but a deliberate choice, and it is this very silence that makes their eventual disappearance so complete and so mysterious. At the height of their influence, a Druid's word could halt an entire army. Across Gaul and Britain, long before Roman legions marched across the countryside, these learned figures wielded a power that was both spiritual and profoundly political. Their authority extended far beyond the sacred groves, reaching into the very fabric of daily life and the highest levels of tribal governance. One of their most formidable powers was the ability to excommunicate an individual from all religious and social ceremonies. To be banished by the Druids was to become a true outcast, cut off from the community, from the favor of the gods, and from all legal protection. It was a social death sentence more feared than any physical punishment. This immense respect was most dramatically displayed on the battlefield. Historical accounts describe how a single Druid, clad in their traditional white robe, could walk unarmed between two opposing forces and command them to lay down their weapons. The mere sight of this revered figure was enough to stop a war. Their role as neutral arbiters and their connection to the divine made them the ultimate peacemakers, their judgment respected by kings and warriors alike. Their influence was the glue that held the often fractious Celtic tribes together. Their calendar was governed by the cycles of nature, and they presided over the most significant festivals of the year. The most famous of these was Samhain, celebrated from sunset on October 31st into the 1st of November. This was not merely a harvest festival, but a sacred threshold when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits was believed to be at its thinnest. The Druids conducted elaborate ceremonies, lighting great bonfires and performing rituals to honor the dead and ensure the sun's return after the long winter. It is from these ancient rites that many of our modern Halloween traditions eventually evolved. Yet, the Roman writers who documented the Druids also cast a long and dark shadow over their legacy. They recorded, with a mixture of horror and propaganda, that the Druids practiced human sacrifice. According to these accounts, they sought divine favor by reading the future in the death throes of a human victim. sometimes placing individuals in massive wicker effigies and setting them ablaze. We must ask how much of this was factual observation and how much was a deliberate campaign to paint the Druids as savage barbarians. By framing them as a brutal and superstitious cult that engaged in such atrocities, Rome provided a moral and political justification for their eventual eradication. The Druids were not just a competing religion, they were portrayed as a direct threat to civilization itself, an enemy that needed to be eliminated for the good of the world. This powerful and often unquestioned narrative became the official reason for their destruction. The terrifying cries of the Druids echoed across the water as Roman legionaries landed on the shores of Mona. This island sanctuary, known today as Anglesey, was the spiritual and intellectual heart of the Celtic world, a final refuge for the Druidic order. In the year 60, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus launched a full-scale military assault aimed directly at this nerve center. He understood that to conquer the Celtic tribes of Britain, he first had to break their spirit, and that meant destroying the Druids. The historian Tacitus recorded the chilling scene that confronted the Roman soldiers. The shoreline was packed with a desperate army of defenders, but it was the figures behind them that made the battle-hardened legionaries freeze in their tracks. Among the armed warriors, Druids and Druidesses stood with their arms raised to the heavens, their faces contorted in fury as they screamed terrible curses upon the invading Romans. They called upon their gods to strike down the enemy, their voices a unified roar of defiance that seemed to shake the very forest. For a moment, the Roman advance faltered, paralyzed by a superstitious dread of this alien magic. But the hesitation did not last. Suetonius Paulinus rallied his troops, urging them not to fear these fanatics. The discipline of the Roman war machine overcame its fear. The legionaries surged forward, cutting down warriors and holy figures alike. They showed no mercy. The sacred groves where generations of Druids had studied and worshipped were put to the torch. The ancient oaks, witnesses to centuries of secret knowledge, were consumed by flames. This was not merely a battle, it was a systematic desecration, a deliberate act of cultural annihilation. The massacre at Mona was the first, most brutal wave of banishment. It was Rome's declaration that the old ways would be erased and that the intellectual core of Celtic resistance would be physically exterminated. But the destruction of their sanctuary only forced the survivors deeper into hiding. What knowledge was lost in those sacred groves as the smoke rose into the British sky? The smoke over Mona had barely cleared when a new and more insidious weapon was deployed against the Druids. The Roman Empire understood that military force alone could not erase an idea, so it turned to the power of law. A series of imperial decrees issued from the very heart of Rome aimed to systematically dismantle the Druidic class through legal persecution. The campaign began with Emperor Augustus, who took the first decisive step by banning any Roman citizen from participating in Druidic rites. This was a strategic move to prevent the blending of cultures and to stop the spread of Druidic influence within the empire's own citizenry. It branded their practices as not just foreign but forbidden. The legal assault intensified under his successor, Tiberius. Historical records suggest he issued a formal decree that outlawed the Druids themselves, targeting their entire order. But it was Emperor Claudius, decades later, who delivered the most comprehensive blow. He formally proscribed the Druidic religion throughout the entire Roman world, making its practice a capital offense. The motivation behind these laws was starkly political. The Druids were not merely priests, they were a rival government. They held the loyalty of the tribes, administered a system of justice that competed with Roman law, and possessed the moral authority to unite disparate clans into a formidable rebellion. By outlawing them, Rome was decapitating the native leadership of conquered territories. The official justification, repeated by Roman historians, was the Druids' alleged practice of human sacrifice. To the Roman sensibilities, which prized order and civilization above all else, This was the ultimate barbarism. It provided a powerful moral pretext for their eradication. Yet in reality, the sacrifice Rome feared most was not of human life, but of its own political control. The Druids were the one cultural force that could inspire the Celtic tribes to remember their shared identity and rise up against their occupiers. The imperial decrees were designed to shatter that unifying spine, transforming the revered scholars and judges into fugitives in their own lands. How do you silence an entire class of people without firing a single arrow? You make their very existence illegal. The Roman decrees had transformed the Druids into outlaws, but it was a new faith that would challenge their very souls. As the Roman Empire itself began to embrace Christianity, the campaign against paganism entered a far more profound and personal phase. This was no longer just a political suppression, it became a spiritual war for the hearts and minds of the Celtic people. The cross now marched where the Roman eagle had once flown, and its mission was the complete conversion of a continent. Early Christian missionaries saw the old religions not merely as competition, but as a diabolical force that had to be utterly uprooted. They targeted the core of Druidic power, which was their sacred connection to the land and its cycles. A powerful strategy emerged, one of systematic replacement rather than outright destruction. These missionaries would often seek out the most revered pagan sites, the very groves and springs where the Druids had communed with their gods, and they would build their churches directly upon that hallowed ground. They understood that by sanctifying a location already imbued with deep spiritual significance, they could ease the transition for the local population, transferring their innate sense of the sacred from the old gods to the new one. This physical overwriting of the Celtic landscape was a masterstroke of cultural engineering, silently erasing the visible markers of the Druidic world. Perhaps the most enduring tactic was the co-opting of pagan festivals. The Great Fire Festival of Samhain, marking the new year and the thinning veil between worlds, was gradually transformed into the Christian observances of All Saints and All Souls' Day, evolving into the Halloween we know today. The joyous spring festival of Imbolc, dedicated to the goddess Brigid and the returning light, was rebranded with a new patron, Saint Brigid, and her feast day was set on February 1st. Even the winter solstice celebrations, which marked the rebirth of the sun, were absorbed into the celebration of Christmas. This was not a random coincidence, it was a deliberate and brilliant policy. By grafting Christian theology onto pre-existing pagan traditions, the missionaries made the new religion feel familiar and inevitable. The rituals remained, but their meaning was fundamentally altered, and with that shift, the Druids lost their primary role as the essential conductors of these cosmic ceremonies. In places like Ireland, which Rome never militarily conquered, this spiritual conquest was led by formidable figures like Saint Patrick. His own writings describe his direct confrontations with the Druids, whom he called Magi, framing his mission as a dramatic battle of divine power against their magic. He famously lit a paschal fire on the Hill of Slain, directly challenging a royal decree from the High King at Tara that no other fires be lit while the king's own festival fire burned. This was a direct and public challenge to the authority of the Druids, who were the king's chief advisors. The story, whether fully historical or not, symbolizes the larger conflict, a new spiritual force boldly defying the old order on its own turf. The Druids were thus caught in a pincer movement. Their political authority had been crushed by Roman law, and now their spiritual and social relevance was being systematically dismantled by a new, organized, and equally determined religion. They were no longer just hiding from soldiers, they were becoming obsolete in the eyes of their own people. What place was left for a Druid when their sacred days were now holy days for another god, and their most powerful rituals had been repurposed for a different faith? While the rest of the Celtic world fell under the shadow of the Roman eagle, one land remained untouched, its green hills never trampled by legionary sandals. Ireland presented a completely different fate for the Druidic tradition, a story not of sudden death, but of slow and remarkable transformation. Here, without the shock of a military invasion, the old intellectual class did not simply vanish into the mist. Instead, they underwent a profound evolution, shedding their pagan skin to survive in a new Christian world. The key to this survival was the emergence of a new class of learned elites, the Fili. A Fili, which means literally a seer or a poet, became the direct heir to the Druids' vast portfolio of knowledge. These were not simple entertainers, they were the new guardians of law, genealogy, history, and prophecy. They wielded the power of satire, a feared weapon that could raise boils on a king's face, or so the legends claimed, and ruin his reputation forever. The Fili inherited the Druids' role as the living memory of their people, but they now operated within an increasingly Christian framework. This was a strategic rebranding on a civilizational scale. The immense oral tradition, the very thing that had defined the Druids for centuries, was too valuable to lose. The new Christian monasteries, which were becoming the centers of learning and power in Ireland, recognized this. They began to collaborate with the Fili, these masters of the old ways, to write everything down. And so, on the isolated, windswept islands off the Irish coast, in quiet monastic scriptoria, something extraordinary happened. The ancient knowledge of the Celts, the myths, the laws, the genealogies, and the epic cycles that the Druids had carried in their minds for generations were meticulously transcribed by monks onto vellum. The very people who were devoted to a new god became the unexpected saviors of the old stories. This was not a peaceful merger born of simple goodwill. It was a complex and likely tense negotiation of cultural power. The old gods were often recast as heroic but flawed ancestors or even as fallen angels. The sacred landscape of springs and hills was given new Christian legends. The Druids' powerful magic was reinterpreted as the potent but lesser craft of sorcerers facing the superior power of saints. In this new Ireland, a high king could no longer openly consult with a pagan Druid, but he could, and did, rely on the counsel of a deeply learned Christian Fili who still knew all the old stories and laws. The Fili ensured that the voice of tradition was never fully silenced. It was simply given a new vocabulary. This Irish transformation reveals a crucial nuance in the story of the Druids' banishment. It shows us that the process was not always a violent annihilation. Sometimes it was a forced assimilation, a quiet and persistent rebranding that allowed the core of the knowledge to survive, even as its original spiritual heart was carved out. The soul of the Druid was hidden within the robe of the poet, and their wisdom was preserved in the very monasteries that had been built to replace them. Across the Irish Sea, a similar story of preservation was unfolding, but with a uniquely Welsh accent. In the rugged hills and deep valleys of Wales, the ancient voice of the Druid found a new home in the song of the bard. These were not mere minstrels, but the officially recognized heirs to a tradition stretching back into the Celtic mists. The medieval Welsh bardic orders became the new, socially acceptable custodians of the old lore, a sanctioned way for the ancient knowledge to survive in plain sight. Their role was formally codified in laws attributed to the 10th century King Hywel Dda, Good Hywel, which laid out their rights, responsibilities, and their vital place in the court of a Welsh prince. This legal recognition was their shield, allowing them to operate openly while safeguarding a lineage that might otherwise have been lost. The bards were organized into a strict and demanding hierarchy, a clear echo of the Druids' own rigorous training. A young apprentice, known as a disciple, would spend years mastering the complex art of Welsh poetry, its 24 strict meters, and the vast body of traditional stories and genealogies. Only after proving his skill could he ascend to the rank of a pensard or chief of song, entitled to a place of honor at the king's table. The highest rank was the Bard Tulu, the poet of the household, responsible for composing stirring battle poems and elegies to commemorate the fallen. This structured system ensured that the knowledge was passed down with precision and care, generation after generation. What they preserved was a treasure trove of ancient Celtic heritage. Their poems and triads, groups of 3 related sayings, contained fragments of old laws, echoes of philosophical concepts, and the genealogies of kings that stretched back to a mythical, pre-Roman past. Epic tales like those found in the Mabinogion, a collection of Welsh stories written down in the later medieval period, are filled with characters and motifs that scholars recognize as deeply Celtic. We encounter powerful enchanters, magical cauldrons of rebirth, and heroes who undergo trials that feel like remnants of much older Druidic initiations. The bard was in effect a walking library, his mind a vault for the history and identity of his people. By wrapping the old wisdom in the beautiful but politically safer container of court poetry, the bards performed a brilliant act of cultural alchemy. They took the potent and now forbidden knowledge of the Druids and transformed it into art. The spiritual authority of the seer was diluted into the social authority of the skilled poet, but the essential thread of memory remained unbroken. The old knowledge did not disappear, it simply went underground, disguised as entertainment and royal praise, waiting for a time when its deeper meanings could be understood once more. What other secrets might be hidden within the verses of an ancient Welsh poem, masquerading as a simple song about a king's bravery? This profound silence is the heart of the mystery. We are left with a void, a total absence of their own voice. Not a single scroll, not one first-hand account written by a Druid themselves has survived, if any ever existed. This was not an accident of history, but a core tenet of their belief system. Their vast and sophisticated knowledge, from complex legal codes to the precise movements of the stars, was considered far too sacred, too powerful to be entrusted to mere parchment. They believed true wisdom was a living thing, passed directly from master to student in a sacred bond of trust and memory. Committing their secrets to writing would have made that knowledge common, stripping it of its spiritual potency and placing it into the hands of the uninitiated. An oral tradition demanded absolute discipline, forging minds of incredible capacity. It ensured that the knowledge was not just learned, but truly understood and embodied by each new generation. This creates an immense dilemma for us today. Our entire understanding of the Druids is filtered through the writings of their conquerors and their rivals, the Romans who sought to justify their eradication, and the Christian monks who later transcribed the old stories. We are trying to reconstruct a symphony from the critiques of its detractors. This leads us to a fascinating contradiction, the Ogham script. Across Ireland and parts of Western Britain, we find standing stones inscribed with this unique alphabet, a series of straight lines and notches carved along the edge of the stone. Ogham was used primarily for practical purposes, to mark territorial boundaries or to memorialize important individuals. It was a public script, not a secret one. Yet, its very existence proves that the Celtic peoples were capable of writing. So why did the Druids, the intellectual elite, seemingly refuse to use it for their most important work? The answer may lie in a strict cultural division. The practical could be written down, but the profoundly sacred could not. This separation makes the loss of their knowledge feel even more deliberate and absolute. We are left to wonder, did a hidden Druidic library ever exist? Were there texts written on perishable wood or vellum that contained their deepest astronomical observations, their most potent prayers, or the complete versions of their epic histories? If such records were made, they would have been the primary target for Roman soldiers and later Christian reformers, who saw them as dangerous pagan artifacts. A single, coordinated burning of such documents would have erased them from history as completely as the sacred groves of Mona were erased from the earth. We are left with only echoes, the ghost of a voice that chose silence as its most powerful form of expression. What profound truths about the natural world and the human spirit died with them, forever locked in the memories of the last true Druids? The silent forests hold their secrets well. While written records are filtered through the lens of their enemies, the very earth itself offers a different kind of testimony, one that is fragmentary and deeply enigmatic. Archaeologists face a unique challenge when searching for the Druids because their most sacred spaces were not grand temples of stone, but the living cathedrals of nature. They worshipped in secluded groves of ancient oak, performed rituals at the edge of sacred springs, and gathered under the open sky for their great fire festivals. These are places that leave almost no permanent mark on the landscape. A stone altar can be found 1,000 years later, but how do you find a clearing in a forest that has long since turned to soil? This profound lack of physical evidence is in itself a powerful clue. It reinforces the idea of a deliberate and systematic banishment, an erasure so complete that it scrubbed them not only from history books, but from the physical world they once ruled. Occasionally, however, the ground does speak, and its voice is often chilling. In the peat bogs of Cheshire, England, the preserved body of a man was discovered, now known as Lindo Man. His death was a violent and ritualistic one. Analysis shows he was struck on the head, garroted, and his throat was cut in a precise sequence. His last meal was a griddle cake containing a small, symbolic portion of mistletoe, a plant sacred to the Druids. He was a healthy, well-groomed man in his mid-20s, not a common criminal, but someone of high status. The nature of his death, the sacred plant in his stomach, and the fact that he was placed in a bog, a liminal space between earth and water believed to be a gateway to the gods, all point to a single, terrifying conclusion. Lindo Man may very well be a rare, physical piece of evidence for the human sacrifices that Roman writers described. He is a ghost from the Druidic world, a silent witness to the dark side of their practices, preserved by the very land they held sacred. In stark contrast, sites like Banishment in Ireland, also known as Navan Fort, present a different kind of mystery. This was a vast ceremonial and royal complex, a place of immense power for centuries. Archaeological excavations revealed a huge, circular structure built around 95 BC, a temple-like building constructed entirely of timber. In a dramatic and deliberate act, this massive structure was filled with stones, set ablaze, and then covered over with a great mound of earth. This was not an attack by an enemy, but a ritual closing, a deliberate and symbolic end to the site's use. While we cannot say for certain that Druids oversaw this ceremony, the scale, the complexity, and the obviously ritualistic nature of its destruction align perfectly with their known role as masters of ceremony. Banishment represents the height of Celtic spiritual and political power, a power that the Druids would have been central to. Yet even here we find no statues of their gods, no inscriptions bearing their names. The absence of grand, dedicated temples to the Druids is deafening. It tells us that their power was not rooted in monuments meant to last for the ages, but in the living, breathing connection between their knowledge and the natural world. When that connection was severed and the last Druid who remembered the rites of a particular grove passed away, the grove itself became just another part of the forest. The earth remembers them only in whispers, in the haunting silence of a bog body and the enigmatic mounds that hide their most profound ceremonies from our view. Centuries later, a new kind of magic began to stir, not in sacred groves, but in the libraries and drawing rooms of scholars and poets. The Romantic era of the 17th and 18th centuries looked back at the ancient past through a misty, sentimental lens, and in that haze the Druid was reborn. This was not a resurrection of the original intellectual class, but a reinvention, a powerful reimagining to suit the tastes of a new age. Figures like the English antiquarian William Stukeley became fascinated with megalithic sites like Stonehenge. He became utterly convinced that these ancient stones were not prehistoric monuments of a forgotten people, but the very temples of the Druids. Stukeley, a man of his time, wove a complex narrative that linked the Druids to the lost tribes of Israel and framed them as noble, patriarchal proto-Christians who believed in a single God. He draped them in long, white robes and gave them grand, flowing beards, an image that became instantly iconic and remains with us today. Yet almost every detail of this vision was a complete fabrication, a beautiful fiction born from a desire to create a romantic, native British heritage. Across the border in Wales, an even more elaborate fabrication was taking shape. Iolo Morgannwg, a stonemason and poet with a formidable imagination, claimed to have discovered a vast collection of ancient Welsh manuscripts. From these, he produced what he said were the authentic rituals and beliefs of the original Druids. He single-handedly invented the gorsedd of the bards of the island of Britain, complete with its ceremonial stone circles, its specific color-coded robes for different bardic ranks, and its entire system of prayers and rituals. He even introduced the now universal symbol of Wales, the three-rayed symbol known as Orn, representing divine inspiration. Iolo's creations were so convincing, so perfectly tailored to the romantic nationalism of the era, that they were widely accepted as genuine ancient tradition and were incorporated into the very heart of the Welsh Eisteddfod cultural festival. So, were Stukely and Iolo mere clever frauds, or was there a deeper purpose to their inventions? While their historical claims were largely fantasy, they were tapping into a profound and very real longing. Their work was not based on factual history, but it was a form of cultural reclamation. In a time when native Celtic cultures were being suppressed, these reinvented traditions gave people a sense of pride and a tangible connection to a glorified past. They created a new vessel for a very old spirit. The question then becomes, did any genuine, hidden threads of knowledge survive to inform these revivals? It is highly unlikely that Stukely or Iolo had access to a secret, unbroken Druidic lineage. The original Druidic order had been shattered too completely. However, it is possible, even probable, that Iolo, as a master of the Welsh bardic tradition, was working with fragments. He did not have a complete ritual book, but he had the old poems and triads. He took the scattered bones of the ancient lore, the themes of transformation, the reverence for the land, and the power of the poetic word that had been preserved by the medieval bards, and he fleshed them out with his own brilliant creativity. He was not preserving an intact system, but he was reassembling a ghost using the cultural memory that had survived in plain sight. The modern Druid revivals, therefore, stand on a fascinating boundary. They are built on a foundation of historical fabrication, yet they are animated by a sincere desire to reconnect with the wisdom of the natural world and the power of the creative spirit, ideals that would have been very familiar to the original Druids. The white robe is a costume, but the search for meaning beneath it is utterly real. So, did they rediscover a lost truth, or did they simply invent a beautiful new one to fill the silence left by a forgotten banishment? Deep in the forests of Welsh and British legend, a figure emerges from the mist who feels strangely familiar. He is Merlin, the wild prophet, the madman of the woods, and the power behind a king's throne. His story, woven into the grand tapestry of the Arthurian cycle, may be one of the most profound literary echoes of the lost Druids. He is not called a Druid in these medieval tales, yet he embodies their spirit so completely that the connection is impossible to ignore. He is a man of two worlds, a bridge between the old Celtic past and the new Christian future. He lives outside of society, drawing his power not from a church, but from the ancient, untamed landscape. He is a master of prophecy, able to see the threads of fate. He is a shapeshifter, a skill often attributed to the most powerful Celtic seers. And most importantly, he is the essential advisor to the king, the one whose counsel determines the fate of a kingdom. This was the precise political role of the High Druids, the power behind the tribal throne. The legends of Merlin can be read as a mythologized memory of that once formidable intellectual class, now reduced to a single magical figure wandering the edges of a changing world. In the earliest Welsh stories, he is not yet the wise old wizard of later romance, but a wild, untamed force named Myrddin. He goes mad after a terrible battle and retreats into the forest of Celadon, living among the animals and gaining the gift of prophecy from his communion with nature. This is a powerful metaphor for the fate of the Druids themselves, driven from the centers of power into the wilderness, their sanity fractured by the trauma of conquest, their wisdom persisting only in the wild places. As the tales were refined and Christianized by writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth, Merlin's character was sanitized. His power was reframed as a mysterious gift from God rather than a pagan craft. He becomes the architect of Camelot, the one who engineers other Pendragon's deception to conceive Arthur, and the prophet who foretells the coming of a great king. Yet even in this new role, his methods feel deeply archaic. He manipulates the very fabric of reality. He speaks with dragons, and he moves massive stones with his magic, much like the Druids were believed to command the elements. What is the story of Merlin's final disappearance, his eternal sleep in a crystal cave or a hidden tower, if not a poetic metaphor for the ultimate banishment of the old ways? The knowledge did not die. The legend suggests it was merely put to sleep, hidden away until the world might need it again. The figure of Merlin gives a human face to a historical tragedy. He is the last great druid, a literary ghost haunting the edges of a new age, his profound wisdom now remembered only as magic, his political authority transformed into a wizard's trick. His enduring presence in our stories is a testament to the power that the Druids once held, and a lingering question about what was truly lost when the last of their kind faded into the forest shadows. The silence left by the Druids is a vacuum that human imagination is desperate to fill. If their knowledge was too valuable to be lost, could it have been secretly preserved, passed down through a hidden network of initiates sworn to secrecy? This is the tantalizing core of the secret society's hypothesis, a theory that suggests the Druids never truly disappeared, they simply went underground. Proponents of this idea point to the strange echoes of Celtic symbolism and esoteric wisdom that seem to resurface centuries later within groups like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians. The Freemasons, with their elaborate initiation rituals, their emphasis on architectural symbolism, and their veneration of a divine grand architect of the universe, seem to operate on a similar principle to the Druids, a belief that profound truth must be earned through disciplined learning and moral development. Could the Masonic Lodge be a distant, formalized descendant of the Druidic Grove? The connections become even more speculative and more alluring when we consider the Knights Templar. This powerful medieval order of warrior monks was suddenly and brutally suppressed in the early 14th century. In the years following their dissolution, legends proliferated that the Templars had discovered something profound during their time in the Holy East, not just Christian relics, but perhaps something older, a secret pre-Christian wisdom. Some theories suggest that during their extensive financial operations across Europe, particularly in areas once thick with Celtic culture, they may have uncovered hidden Druidic texts or initiated surviving members of a secret lineage. The sudden wealth and peculiar rituals of the Templars are then reinterpreted as evidence that they had become the new guardians of an ancient, banned knowledge. But how seriously should we take these speculative links? The evidence for a direct historical lineage is virtually non-existent. There is no documented meeting between a Druid and a Templar, no secret scroll that links the Ogham alphabet to Masonic symbols. The timelines are separated by hundreds of years, a chasm of silence that is difficult to bridge with anything more than conjecture. Historians largely dismiss these ideas as a form of romantic syncretism, where later groups project their own spiritual longings onto an idealized and mysterious past. Yet the persistence of these theories is itself a form of evidence. It speaks to a deep, abiding belief that the wisdom of the Druids was too potent to simply vanish into the soil. The human mind rebels against such a complete erasure. We instinctively feel that a class of individuals who commanded such respect, who held the laws of nature and society in their minds for generations, must have had a contingency plan. The secret society hypothesis is that plan. It is the comforting thought that the light of their knowledge was not extinguished but merely hidden, carried like a shielded flame through the dark ages by a succession of guardians. Perhaps the truth is less literal but equally meaningful. Maybe the Freemasons and other esoteric orders did not inherit a specific, secret doctrine from the Druids themselves, but rather independently rediscovered similar truths about the universe, the human condition, and the power of symbolic teaching. They may have been drawn to the same sacred geometries and natural cycles that the Druids revered, not because they found a hidden manuscript, but because they were looking at the same sky and the same human soul. The idea of a direct lineage may be a myth, but the recurrence of certain archetypes, the wise teacher, the initiatory journey, the reverence for nature's order, suggests that the spirit of the Druid, if not their historical organization, is a perennial feature of the human search for understanding. So we are left with a compelling choice. Do we believe the Druids were utterly annihilated, their knowledge lost forever in the smoke of Mona and the quiet assimilation of the monasteries? Or do we choose to believe in the shadows, in the possibility of a secret handshake passed down through 1,000 years, a whispered word that still carries the echo of an ancient oak grove? The absence of proof is not proof of absence, it is simply the space where mystery lives. The very words we speak can be ancient maps pointing to a forgotten world. We can follow these linguistic trails into the heart of the Druidic mystery, finding their ghostly fingerprints preserved in the languages and landscapes they once dominated. Consider the name Dronometon, a place deep in ancient Galatia in what is now Turkey. This was a sanctuary for Celtic tribes who had migrated far from their homeland. Dronometon translates directly to oak sanctuary, a powerful combination of the Celtic word dru for oak and nemeton, meaning sacred grove or sanctuary. This was not just a town, it was a consecrated space, a physical anchor for their faith in a foreign land. Its name is a clear and undeniable signal, a signpost declaring that this was a place of Druidic assembly, of judgment, and of ceremony. The oak tree was not merely a plant to the Druids, it was a living temple. Its deep roots and towering branches connected the underworld, the middle world of humans, and the upper world of the gods. The word Druid itself is thought to be intimately linked to this concept, deriving from a root meaning oak knowledge or oak seer. So when we say the word Druid, we are unknowingly speaking of the oak, invoking the very core of their identity with every syllable. This sacred geography is etched all across the Celtic world. Countless place names in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland reference the Nemeton, often hidden within modern names like Nematobriga in Spain or Medionmeton in Scotland. These were the nerve centers of their spiritual life, and their names have stubbornly refused to fade away. What other secrets are locked within the simple name of a hill or a forest that we pass by every day? Beyond place names, the complex structure of the Celtic languages themselves may hold a deeper philosophical code. The Druids were masters of memory and oral tradition, and they expressed their wisdom in a uniquely threefold pattern. This love for triads, groups of three related concepts, became a foundational feature of Celtic literature. We see it in the Welsh triads, which codify history and law in groups of three, and in the Irish saying that every good story has three parts. This was not just a poetic device, it was likely a method of teaching and preserving complex ideas. A Druidic teaching might be framed as three truths of the natural world or three duties of a king. By bundling knowledge into triads, they made it easier to memorize and pass down through generations without writing. The stories themselves became vessels. The great Irish epic, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, is far more than a simple cattle raid. Woven into its tales of heroes and magic are reflections on sovereignty, the rightful relationship between a ruler and the land, and the dire consequences of breaking sacred laws. These were the very concepts the Druids were responsible for teaching and upholding. When a king in a myth is cursed with deformities for his misdeeds, it is not just a fantastical event, it is a lesson in justice and cosmic balance, a core piece of Druidic philosophy disguised as entertainment. The language itself, with its intricate grammatical structures and its capacity for multiple layers of meaning, was the perfect hiding place. A poem praising a chieftain could simultaneously be a meditation on the movement of the stars. A riddle about a tree could contain a lesson on ethics. The bards and fili who came after the Druids were trained in this art of layered speech, ensuring that the old wisdom survived not as a forbidden doctrine, but as a beautiful and respected art form. The Banishment may have silenced the Druids as a political force, but it could not erase the words they had woven into the very fabric of their culture. Their voice did not echo in the forests alone, but in the everyday speech of their people, waiting centuries for someone to listen for the older, deeper meanings hidden just beneath the surface. Far to the north, beyond the Great Wall built by the Romans to contain the wild lands, lay a realm of mist and mountain that even the legions feared to conquer. The Caledonian forests of Scotland presented a vast and impenetrable refuge, a final sanctuary for those fleeing the systematic purge to the south. Could the last true Druids have vanished into these deep glens and hidden islands, preserving their ancient ways long after the groves of Mona were ash? The Romans called this place Caledonia, and its people, the Picts, were a formidable and mysterious adversary. Roman historians wrote of them with a mixture of respect and dread, describing their fierce resistance and their strange, tattooed bodies. More importantly, they noted that the Picts had their own class of wise men and seers, figures who held significant influence over their warrior kings. While these accounts do not explicitly name them as Druids, the description is strikingly familiar. These were individuals who interpreted omens, presided over rituals, and counseled leaders in battle, a role indistinguishable from that of the Druids further south. It is a compelling possibility that the intellectual core of the Druidic order, shattered by Roman military campaigns, retreated northward, merging with and empowering the existing spiritual traditions of the Picts to create a last bastion of the old knowledge. This theory finds echoes in the rich tapestry of Scottish folklore, where figures known as the Féin or wise women and men of the hills appear again and again. These were not simple hermits, but individuals believed to possess deep knowledge of herbal lore, weather patterns, and prophecy. Legends speak of seers who could foretell the outcome of battles and chieftains who would not make a major decision without consulting them. The most famous of these figures is perhaps Thomas the Rhymer, a 13th century laird said to have been gifted with the tongue of prophecy after a journey to the land of the Fairy Queen. While these stories are medieval, they often feel like the faded, folkloric memory of a much older and more powerful class of intellectuals, the Druids. Their political authority diminished, but their reputations as oracles and wise folk enduring for centuries in the oral tradition. The most tantalizing and enigmatic evidence, however, lies not in stories but in stone. Scattered across Scotland, from the Shetland Isles to the lowlands, are hundreds of carved standing stones adorned with the mysterious symbols of the Picts. These are not random scratchings, they form a coherent, if still undeciphered, symbolic language. We see recurring images of fantastic beasts like the Pictish beast, intricate geometric patterns like the double disc and Z-rod, and everyday objects like mirrors and combs. For generations, scholars have debated their meaning. Are they records of battles, declarations of lineage, or markers of territory? Another, more intriguing possibility is that these symbols are a cryptic remnant of a Druidic symbolic language. If the Druids who fled to Scotland sought to preserve their knowledge while evading both Roman and later Christian persecution, they would have needed a way to encode their wisdom in a form that was permanent, yet meaningless to the uninitiated. The Pictish symbols carved on immutable stone could be that very code. A mirror and comb might not signify vanity, but could instead represent a philosophical concept about reflection and unity. The mysterious Z-rod could be a symbolic representation of a lightning bolt, denoting divine power or a specific deity. This was not a written language to be read, but a symbolic one to be interpreted, a system perfectly suited to a tradition that prized oral explanation over written text. The ultimate fate of this northern refuge remains shrouded in the same mists that cling to the Highland peaks. The conversion of Scotland to Christianity, led by figures like Saint Columba, would have eventually challenged this last stronghold of the old ways. The stories of Columba's confrontations with the Pictish Druids and sorcerers at the court of King Bride echo the earlier conflicts in Ireland. Yet, the rugged isolation of the Highlands may have allowed fragments of the tradition to persist for far longer than anywhere else, not as a formal Druidic order, but as the secret, guarded knowledge of certain families and seers. When we look at a weathered Pictish stone standing alone in a Scottish field, we are not just looking at an ancient artifact, we are potentially looking at a last, silent message from a banished intellectual class, a library of stone whose books we have not yet learned how to read. What profound truths did they carve into these monuments, hoping that one day someone would understand the key? While the Druids of Ireland and Wales found ways to transform and endure, their counterparts across the sea in Gaul vanished almost without a trace. This was not a slow fading, but a sudden and decisive erasure. The fate of the Druids in mainland Europe, in the lands known today as France and parts of Germany, reveals a chilling truth. The secret banishment was not a single event, but a process whose success depended entirely on the intensity and duration of Roman control. In Gaul, the Roman grip was absolute, and the mechanisms of cultural destruction were applied with relentless force. Julius Caesar's conquest in the 1st century BC was not just a military victory, it was the beginning of a profound cultural overhaul. The Romans did not merely occupy the land, they systematically rebuilt it in their own image. They constructed a network of paved roads that connected new, gleaming cities like Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon. These urban centers were designed as engines of Romanization, where the local Gallic aristocracy was seduced by the comforts and privileges of Roman life. To gain status and power, these chieftains had to adopt Latin, wear Roman dress, and participate in the imperial cult. In this New World Order, what place was there for a Druid? Their ancient role as judges was made obsolete by Roman courts administering Roman law. Their function as historians and genealogists was irrelevant to a society that now recorded its history in Latin on stone monuments. The very foundation of their authority, their deep connection to the tribal lands and customs, was shattered by a centralized, urban-focused administration. The old sacred groves were cut down to make way for vineyards and villas, physically erasing the landscapes of their power. The adoption of Christianity in Gaul was also swift and thorough, delivered through established Roman trade routes and administrative channels. Without the geographic isolation that protected Ireland, or the strong, independent bardic orders that preserved culture in Wales, the Gallic people had no cultural immune system left to resist. Their old gods and the Druids who served them were not transformed. They were simply abandoned in favor of the new Roman gods and later the Christian god. The complete disappearance of the Druids in Gaul stands in stark contrast to their survival in the Celtic fringe. It proves that their banishment was most effective not where the sword fell hardest, but where the entire structure of a society was deliberately and permanently dismantled and rebuilt. The silence in Gaul is the loudest, a testament to a conquest so complete that it left no shadows for the old wise men to hide in. What does it mean for a culture when its intellectual heart is not just suppressed, but its very memory is paved over by stone and statute? A king's greatest fear might not have been a rival's army, but a poet's sharp tongue. In the world of the Celts, satire was not mere mockery or entertainment. It was a sanctioned and devastating form of social control, a weaponized language believed to carry tangible, physical consequences. A druid or a fili, the poet-seers who inherited their authority, could compose a poem of such cutting precision that it was thought to literally mar its target. Legends and laws describe how a powerful satire could raise blisters or boils on the face of an unjust ruler, branding him with visible shame for all to see. This was not a metaphor, it was a deeply held cultural belief in the active power of words to alter reality itself. A king who broke his sacred oaths or ruled selfishly could find himself not only politically isolated, but physically disfigured by the verbal art of a respected intellectual. His reputation, his honor, and his very face could be scarred by a few perfectly chosen words. This power made the druid and the fili incredibly dangerous to any centralized authoritarian power. While a Roman emperor could execute a rebel, how does an empire combat an enemy whose most potent weapon is a rhyme? You cannot imprison a poem, and you cannot stop a satire from being whispered from one village to the next. This was a form of influence that operated entirely outside the framework of legions and legal codes. It was a check on authority rooted in the collective conscience of the people, enforced by their most learned members. The ability to wield satire effectively required immense skill and training. It was not a reckless insult, but a highly formalized art. The poet had to compose within strict metrical rules, using complex wordplay and allusion to make their critique unassailable and memorable. A poorly crafted satire would have no power, but a masterfully executed one was considered a genuine curse. This reflects a worldview where language and sound were not separate from the physical world, but intimately connected to it. A truthful accusation, given the proper artistic form and delivered by a person of authority, was believed to resonate through the very fabric of existence, leaving a mark as real as any sword stroke. So when a druid stood before a chieftain, his words carried the weight of law, tradition, and what was perceived as divine judgment. This soft power was perhaps the most formidable aspect of their role, a reminder that true authority does not always reside in the sword arm, but sometimes in the voice that can make a king flinch at the sound of his own name. This philosophical conflict ran far deeper than a simple disagreement over gods. At its heart, it was a battle for the soul of reality itself, a fundamental incompatibility between two ways of seeing the universe. The Druidic world was animistic, alive with spirit in every stream, every ancient oak, and every gust of wind. The divine was not a distant, singular entity, but a pervasive, immanent presence woven into the very fabric of nature. A druid's role was to be a mediator within this living network, to interpret the voices of the land and maintain a sacred balance between the human community and the vibrant, conscious world around it. Their rituals were not about reaching upward to a heaven beyond, but about harmonizing with the powerful forces already present in the here and now. Christianity, by stark contrast, presented a transcendent God, a single, all-powerful creator who stood apart from his creation. The natural world was not divine in itself, but was a testament to his glory, a beautiful but temporary vessel for humanity's spiritual journey toward salvation. This was a monumental shift in perspective. The sacred was no longer found in the whispering forest, but in the words of a holy book and the walls of a church. This difference created an unbridgeable divide. For the Christian missionaries, the Druidic veneration of nature looked dangerously like the worship of creation instead of the Creator. The old gods were not seen as alternative paths to truth, but as demons, fallen angels deceiving humanity and leading them into sin. A sacred grove was not a temple, it was a place of pagan idolatry that needed to be purified, often by being cut down and replaced with a chapel. This was more than a theological debate, it was a clash over humanity's fundamental relationship with the cosmos. The Druids saw humanity as one part of a vast, interconnected web of life, bound by reciprocal duties to the land and its unseen guardians. The new faith placed humanity at the center of a divine drama, given dominion over nature and tasked with subduing it in the name of a higher purpose. In the emerging medieval order, which was consolidating under a universal church and hierarchical feudal structures, the decentralized, localized, and nature-bound wisdom of the Druids had no place. Their power was tied to the specific spirits of a specific valley or a particular tribe's ancestral oak. Christianity offered a unified, portable system of belief that could be replicated in any village, any kingdom, transcending local loyalties and binding diverse peoples under a single spiritual authority. The Druids were not just outmatched by a more organized religion, they were philosophically obsolete in a world that was increasingly defining progress as moving away from the wild and toward a structured celestial kingdom. Their profound connection to the earth, once the source of their immense authority, became the very reason for their inevitable defeat. How could a faith of the forest compete with a faith that was building a cathedral over it? A new kind of holy figure walked the land, one who understood the old ways too well to simply destroy them. The Celtic saints did not arrive as foreign conquerors, but often emerged from the very communities they sought to convert, and their genius lay in their strategic absorption of druidic functions. They became the new mediators between the people and the divine, offering a familiar sense of sacred order under a different name. Nowhere is this transformation clearer than in the life of Saint Bridget of Kildare. Her legacy is a perfect mosaic of old and new, where the pre-Christian goddess Bridget, a deity of poetry, healing, and smithcraft, was seamlessly reborn as a Christian saint. The goddess's sacred fire, once tended by Druids, was now kept perpetually burning by a dedicated community of nuns at Kildare. This was not merely a change of personnel, it was a direct transfer of spiritual infrastructure. The fire itself was the point, a constant, visible symbol of the divine presence that the community had always relied upon, now legitimized within a Christian framework. Saint Bridget's feast day on February 1st is another profound clue. This date is the ancient festival of Imbolc, the traditional start of spring in the Celtic calendar, a time sacred to the goddess Bridget. The Druids would have presided over the ceremonies marking the return of the sun and the first signs of new life in the land. By placing Saint Bridget's Day here, the new church effectively redirected the deep-seated seasonal devotions of the people. The rituals of hope and purification for the coming year were now offered to a saint, not a goddess, but the fundamental human need to mark that turning of the wheel remained satisfied. Her associations further cemented this role. She was the patron saint of poets, echoing the Druidic mastery of language and memory. She was a healer, taking over the Druids' deep knowledge of herbal lore and sacred wells. She was even linked to smithcraft, a transformative art that the Druids would have seen as a powerful, almost magical manipulation of the elements. Saint Bridget did not confront the old powers, she enveloped them. She offered a spiritual continuity so convincing that the common person could embrace the new faith without feeling they had abandoned the ancestral rhythms that gave their world meaning. The saint became the acceptable public face for traditions that had been forced into secrecy. What was lost, however, was the independent political authority of the Druid. A saint could inspire and intercede, but she could not legally banish a king or halt an army with a single word. The profound, worldly power of the intellectual class was gently but firmly neutered, transformed into the intercessory power of a holy figure who answered to a higher, centralized church. The sacred fire still burned, but the hand that tended it now served a different master. The true cost of their banishment is measured not in lives but in the silence that followed. We must confront the staggering reality that an entire intellectual tradition, a complete system of knowledge built over centuries, was systematically dismantled and lost. This was not the random decay of time, it was the deliberate burning of a library that existed only in memory, one of the most profound cultural tragedies of the ancient world. Think of the vast curriculum a Druid mastered over 20 years of training. Every single subject was vulnerable to erasure. Their understanding of native herbal medicine was not mere folk remedy. It was a sophisticated science of the local ecosystem, a deep knowledge of which plant cured which ailment, when it should be harvested for maximum potency, and how to prepare it. This was a living pharmacy tailored to the specific diseases and environment of Northern Europe, and it died with the last Druids who held those secrets in their minds. Their legal systems were equally complex. Celtic law was not a simple set of rules, but an intricate web of precedent, obligation, and restorative justice. It governed everything from property disputes and inheritance to the complex relationships between clans and the responsibilities of kingship. The Druids were the supreme judges who interpreted this law, their decisions ensuring social order for generations. When they were outlawed, this entire framework of governance collapsed, replaced by Roman law. Centuries of nuanced legal wisdom, developed to suit the unique character of Celtic society, vanished overnight. Perhaps the most tantalizing loss lies in their astronomy. These were meticulous observers of the night sky. They tracked the cycles of the moon, the movements of planets, and the subtle shifts of the seasons with a precision that allowed them to create sophisticated calendars like the Coligny calendar, a fragmented bronze artifact that hints at a deep mathematical understanding of time. What cosmic patterns did they identify that we have since forgotten? What predictions could they make based on a lifetime of unwritten observation? Their entire historical record is the final, heartbreaking void. The Druids were the historians of their people, the keepers of genealogies that stretched back to mythical founders, and the memorizers of epic poems that chronicled great migrations, battles, and the lives of heroes. This was the Celtic people's own story of themselves, their identity, and their past. Its loss means we can only view Celtic history through the distorted lens of their conquerors. We are left with a ghost of a civilization, its soul erased in a campaign of cultural annihilation. The question is not just what we know was lost, but what profound truths about the natural world and the human experience died with them, secrets we may never rediscover. This ancient silence is now being filled with new voices. In the quiet of a suburban garden or the shared space of an online gathering, modern Druids are once again honoring the cycles of the earth. Organizations like the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, often called OBOD, have built a worldwide community, offering structured courses through the mail and the internet that guide seekers through a path of personal and spiritual development. Their practices are a tapestry woven from many threads, drawing inspiration from the old Celtic myths preserved by the bards, from a deep reverence for nature, and from contemporary ecological awareness. A modern Druid might celebrate the eightfold wheel of the year, marking festivals like Samhain and the summer solstice, not with animal sacrifice, but with meditation, storytelling, and rituals that express gratitude for the natural world. They study the old law not as a rigid doctrine, but as a source of symbolic wisdom, seeking to reconnect with the land and their own creative potential in a deeply disconnected modern age. This vibrant movement, however, lies at the heart of a passionate debate. Are these groups genuinely reviving an ancient spiritual path, or have they created something entirely new, a meaningful spirituality inspired by a romanticized vision of the past? The truth is complex and lies somewhere in between. Critics point out the obvious, that there is no unbroken lineage connecting a member of OBOD in the 21st century to a Druid in the sacred grove of Mona. The original tradition was shattered, its secrets lost. The rituals practiced by modern Druids are, by necessity, modern creations, pieced together from fragmentary historical accounts, Celtic mythology, and a healthy dose of intuition and creative adaptation. They are building a spiritual home using the beautiful but often incomplete blueprints left by the bards and the classical writers. Yet to dismiss them as mere historical reenactors misses the profound purpose of their work. The modern Druid revival is less about archaeological accuracy and more about a powerful act of reclamation. It is an attempt to answer a deep human longing for a spirituality that is immanent, that finds the divine not in a distant heaven, but in the rustling leaves of an oak tree and the turning of the seasons. In an era of climate crisis, their emphasis on ecological stewardship and a sacred relationship with the earth feels not like a historical curiosity, but an urgent and relevant philosophy. The white robes may be a romantic symbol, but the desire to live in harmony with the natural world is a timeless need. So, the question of authenticity may be the wrong one to ask. Perhaps these modern druids are not uncovering a lost truth so much as they are planting a new seed in very old soil. They are listening to the same wind that whispered through the ancient groves and finding their own way to answer its call. The old wizard in the story never simply loses a duel, he is outwitted by a clever saint. Across the Celtic world, the folklore that emerged in the centuries after the Banishment is filled with these poignant encounters, where the powerful seers of the old world are systematically outmatched and displaced. These are not just simple tales of good versus evil, they are layered cultural documents, ghost stories about a profound historical trauma. The once revered druid, the intellectual and spiritual pillar of society, is gradually recast in these narratives as the marginal figure, the wild man of the woods, the tricky sorcerer, or the dangerous witch. Their vast, sophisticated knowledge is diminished, rebranded as mere witchcraft or the unpredictable magic of the fairy folk. This narrative shift was a powerful tool for the new social order. It allowed a culture to explain away the disappearance of its own wise ones, framing their loss not as a tragic conquest, but as the inevitable triumph of a superior truth over a charming but ultimately flawed superstition. Consider the recurring figure of the Cailleach, the divine hag of Scottish and Irish lore. She is a primordial being who shapes the landscape with her staff, commanding the storms and the very turning of the seasons. She is a sovereign force of nature, an echo of a time when the divine was wild and untamed. Yet in later stories, she is often portrayed as a malevolent old witch who must be defeated or placated by a hero. Her immense creative power is reduced to a localized nuisance, a problem to be solved. This mirrors the fate of the Druids themselves, whose cosmic authority over law and nature was shrunk down to the petty mischief of a storybook enchantress. The same pattern appears in the Welsh tales of the Gwylion, the spectral hags of the mountains. These were not always simple monsters. They were often described as knowledgeable, ancient women who guarded specific passes and springs, figures you would approach for wisdom or a safe journey. But in a Christianized world, their connection to the old, pagan landscape made them suspicious. They transformed from local guardians into terrifying, otherworldly hazards to be avoided. Their wisdom became a curse, their sacred sites haunted ground. Even the famous fairy folk, the Owls She of Ireland, can be seen through this lens. These were not the tiny, winged sprites of later Victorian imagination. In the oldest stories, they were the gods and goddesses of the Tuatha De Danann, the mythical predecessors of the Irish people. After their defeat, they were said to have retreated into the burial mounds and ancient forests, becoming the people of the mounds. The Druids, as the intermediaries with these deities, would have been the ones who understood their ways and conducted the rituals to honor them. When the new religion arrived, these powerful, ancestral gods were demoted to capricious fairies, and the Druids' sacred knowledge of how to interact with them was recast as dangerous dabbling in fairy magic. A story about a farmer who angers the fairies by plowing a fairy fort is on a deeper level a memory of a time when disturbing a sacred site without the guidance of a druid would have been unthinkable. The rituals are forgotten, but the superstitious fear remains, a hollow echo of a once profound respect. The most telling confrontations are those between saints and magicians. In the life of Saint Patrick, his main adversaries are the Druids of the High King. The stories are filled with dramatic magical contests, but the outcome is always the same. The saint's power, derived from his Christian god, effortlessly overwhelms their pagan magic. A druid levitates only to be cast down when Patrick prays. A druid calls forth darkness, but Patrick brings back the light. These are not historical accounts, they are theological arguments written as folklore. They serve a clear purpose to demonstrate that the old ways, for all their apparent power, are ultimately inferior and must yield to the new faith. The Druid is not just defeated, he is made to look foolish and ineffectual, his deep, learned tradition reduced to a cheap parlor trick that fails in the face of true divinity. So when we hear a folk tale about a wise woman whose herbal cures are suddenly called witchcraft, or a legend of a forest spirit driven away by the sound of a church bell, we are not just being entertained. We are listening to the lingering echoes of a great silencing. These stories are the dreams a culture has about its own forgotten past, a subconscious confession that someone very important was here and then was gently but firmly shown the door. What does it say about us that we turned our greatest teachers into monsters and tricksters, simply because they spoke for a world we had decided to leave behind? Our entire image of the Druid is filtered through the eyes of their conquerors. To understand the true nature of their banishment, we must question the very sources that tell us their story. The most detailed accounts come from Roman writers like Julius Caesar, Tacitus, and Pliny the Elder, men who were not neutral observers but active participants in a campaign of imperial expansion. Their descriptions of human sacrifice and barbaric rites served a powerful political purpose. By painting the Druids as savage priests who engaged in monstrous acts, Rome provided itself with a moral justification for conquest. It was not merely a land grab, it was a civilizing mission to rid the world of a brutal and superstitious cult. Julius Caesar, in his Gallic Wars, needed to justify his prolonged and expensive campaigns to the Senate back in Rome. His vivid accounts of wicker men filled with burning victims were not just ethnographic notes, they were propaganda. He presented the Celts as a people in desperate need of Roman law and order, their own intellectual leaders as the chief architects of their barbarism. This narrative transformed a military invasion into a moral crusade. Tacitus, writing decades later, described the assault on Mona with a dramatist's flair. The screaming Druids and their terrifying curses served to highlight the bravery of the Roman soldiers who overcame such superstitious dread. His account glorifies Roman discipline in the face of primitive fanaticism, reinforcing the idea that the empire was bringing light to a dark and chaotic land. Even Pliny the Elder's seemingly objective description of Druids harvesting mistletoe with a golden sickle carries a subtle bias. He frames their rituals as strange and exotic, reinforcing their otherness to a Roman audience. We must ask how much of this was factual reporting and how much was a carefully constructed caricature. The Romans were masters of information warfare. They understood that to permanently dismantle a culture, you must first destroy its moral authority. By branding the Druids as practitioners of human sacrifice, they made their eradication not just acceptable but necessary. The truth likely existed in a gray area. The discovery of Lindoman suggests that ritual killing did occur, but was it the central, defining practice of Druidism as the Romans claimed, or a rare, extreme act reserved for moments of profound crisis? The Roman sources never mention the Druids' complex legal system, their decades of astronomical study, or their role as peacemakers. They focus almost exclusively on the sensational and the grotesque. This was a deliberate act of erasure, reducing a multifaceted intellectual class to a single, monstrous stereotype to make their banishment palatable. The real secret may not be what the Druids did, but how completely their enemies succeeded in controlling the story of who they were. If the only history written about you is composed by those who sought your annihilation, how can your true voice ever be recovered? Their disappearance reshaped our very relationship with the earth. We can view the Druids through a startlingly modern lens, not as sorcerers, but as the ancient world's first ecologists, whose entire philosophy was built upon a sacred reciprocity with the living world. Their reverence was not abstract, it was intensely specific and practical. The oak tree was their ultimate symbol of wisdom, not by chance, but because it is a keystone species. An ancient oak supports an entire ecosystem, from the insects in its bark to the birds in its branches and the fungi connected to its roots. The Druids saw this intricate web of life and understood the oak as a pillar of the natural world, a living library of interdependence. Their rituals reflected this profound understanding. Pliny described the ceremony for harvesting mistletoe from an oak, a rare and sacred event. The Druid, clad in white, would carefully cut the plant with a golden sickle, ensuring it never touched the ground, while others held a white cloth to catch it. This was not mere superstition. It was a ritual of deep respect, acknowledging the potency of the plant and the sanctity of the tree that hosted it. They treated the forest not as a warehouse of resources, but as a cathedral whose every element was alive with meaning. This ecological awareness extended to the entire landscape. Sacred groves were not just pretty clearings, they were legally protected nature reserves, off limits to logging or development. Springs and rivers were seen as portals to the divine, their pure waters essential to life and ritual. The Druids acted as the guardians of these places, the enforcers of a spiritual law that demanded the preservation of the natural order. Their calendar was a wheel of the year tied directly to agricultural and pastoral cycles, from the lambing season of Imbolc to the harvest feast of Lugnasad. They did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as one vocal part of a vast, conscious community that included the land, the animals, and the spirits of place. Their banishment, then, was more than a religious or political victory. It was a fundamental shift in humanity's operating system. The Roman worldview, later reinforced by a certain interpretation of Christianity, increasingly framed the natural world as a resource to be managed, a wilderness to be tamed, and a possession to be claimed. The forest was no longer a sacred grove, it was timber for ships and villas. The spring was no longer a goddess, it was a water source for an aqueduct. This was a move from a philosophy of partnership to one of dominion. The Druids stood in the way of this new paradigm because their very existence argued that the land had rights, that it was not merely property. By silencing them, a crucial voice for the earth itself was lost. What might our world look like today if that ancient ecological wisdom had been allowed to shape our progress instead of being banished to the realm of fairy tales? The Druids did not vanish in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow and relentless process spanning centuries. Their secret banishment was a multi-layered campaign, a strategic dismantling of an entire intellectual class through military might, legal persecution, religious conversion, and cultural assimilation. Roman legions crushed their physical strongholds, imperial decrees outlawed their very existence, and a new faith systematically overwrote their spiritual authority. They were not merely wiped out, they were systematically erased. Their political power was shattered, their profound knowledge suppressed, and their enduring legacy transformed into folklore and poetry, a safer echo of its original power. The robed figure disappearing into the mist is more than just a lost priest. It is the ghost of a lost way of understanding the world, a philosophy that saw the divine not in a distant heaven, but in the whispering leaves of an ancient oak and the turning of the sacred seasons. That particular connection to the earth was severed, and we are left to wonder what profound truths about nature and our place within it were lost with them. What piece of that forgotten wisdom do you think we need to rediscover most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.